Okay, it's Tuesday. I've been up for a long time today. Oops, excuse me. I realized that I always seem to either take my hair out of a ponytail or put it into a ponytail, excuse me, while I'm reading. And I think it's because it's just nice to have something to do with my hands. But anyway, page 648. I'm kind of at the top. I hope the sound is okay. Excuse me. I hope the sound is okay. And yeah. Nothing else to announce over here. Oh, hello, welcome. Okay, so the last thing we were talking about was. Oh, that got really fun. We're in a fun section now. Okay, basically, Robert Moses, has this big, very ambitious plan to put a highway across lower Manhattan and to have a bridge. No, initially the plan other people made was to have a tunnel from Brooklyn to Manhattan, but Robert Moses was like, no, let's make this a big bridge that you can drive over and that is like very large, and beautiful, and that would be a little bit cheaper. He also is really interested in it because it would be very beautiful and grand, and he can point at it and say, look what I did, because he loves to do that. But people are not happy because lower Manhattan, like Battery Park, is a green space that is much beloved. Okay. And it wasn't from either sea or air that the value of park and harbor was most apparent. It was from the ground, from the nearby streets of the city, from the bleak, narrow concrete canyons of lower Manhattan, from which towering masses of concrete and steel had crushed sunlight and sky and green grass and trees, and by hemming between them the swirling concentration of humanity, 500,000 human beings worked in Manhattan's single southernmost mile. 500,000, that's amazing. Peace. If there was ever a place in which a man occasionally needed to be alone for a while, to sit in the open in the sun among the grass and trees, for a minute or two, to escape from crowds and noise, that place was Lower Manhattan. And in the streets of Lower Manhattan, there was no place to do so. There should, moreover, have been a sense of the sea in Lower Manhattan, which was, after all, the seamost tip of the island that was the world's largest seaport. But there was no sense of sea in Lower Manhattan. Skyscraper walls blocked that out too. There was no sense of history either. Of all the qualities that the skyscrapers had crushed out of Lower Manhattan's streets, it was perhaps history whose disappearance was most poignant to New York's reformer aristocrats. For familiar as they were with the city's early history and with the early history of the fledgling nation of which the city had been a part, especially familiar because many of them were direct descendants of the men who had made it, they were well aware how much of it had been made in those streets when those streets were the city. It was, for example, in Fort James, at the foot of the island, that Jacob Leisler in 1689 persuaded his fellow militia captains to sign, on the head of a drum, a document ousting the latest royal governor, thereby giving New York 2 years of self-government. And it was in that fort, with drums rattling, that 2 years later, a new governor hanged Leisler from a gallows. Wait, okay, I don't know enough about this. There's this book called Gotham, I think, and it talks about New York history up to, oh, when does it stop? It stops at like maybe 1800 or something. Like it stops pretty early. This is very interesting. Wow. Back then was like when we're talking about the late 1600s, I want to say that was back when when Manhattan was a Dutch colony. But I don't know. It was in a courthouse in Lower Manhattan that, in 1735, in a case from which the best New York defense attorneys had been barred, the famous lawyer Alexander Hamilton, smuggled in from Philadelphia, rose to startle the court by announcing that he would represent a printer charged with libel, told the jury that their verdict would determine whether men had the right to oppose tyrants by writing the truth, and persuaded them to acquit John Peter Zenger. Wow. Okay, this is really interesting. I'm underlining this. So it's like, an important moment in free speech history. Those streets echoed to the shouts of throngs led by the Sons of Liberty carrying the Liberty poles that were erected on the Commons, later City Hall Park, as fast as British soldiers could cut them down. To the tramp of marching men, five dust-stained, 2 words, okay, 5 dust-stained regiments George Washington had led south from Boston, and to the first public reading on the Commons to troops formed into a great hollow square around their general of the Declaration of Independence. Those streets had seen despair. One morning, the harbor that had been empty the night before was a forest of masts. The British fleet had arrived, 130 ships bearing 31,000 redcoat and Hessian soldiers. What is Hessian? I don't know. I'm not looking it up. Veterans of 100 battles. Soon the hills of Staten Island were white with their tents. After the raw and ragged Continentals had been routed at the Battle of Long Island and driven off Manhattan Island, Washington, watching from across the river, wept as the Hessians bayoneted the wounded at the last outpost at Fort Washington. Okay, I have to see what Hessians mean. It's a German mercenary serving in the British forces during the American Revolution. Okay. I learn things all the time. Interesting. There were 30,000 to 37,000 of them, which was about 25% of British land forces. Interesting. The only troops that walked those streets until the end of the war 7 years later were troops wearing the red coats of the oppressor. But those streets had seen triumph too. At the end of the war, Washington returned. Quote, "The troops just leaving us were equipped as if for show, and with their scarlet uniforms and burnished arms made a brilliant display," wrote one woman. "The troops that marched in, on the contrary, were ill-clad and weather-beaten, and made a forlorn appearance, but they were our troops." It was in those streets at Francis Tavern and Pearl and Broad that their leader, having just refused a crown, took farewell of his weeping officers, weeping himself as he did so, and then walking silently to the barge waiting at Whitehall Ferry. And it was to those streets that George Washington returned 6 years later in a barge rowed by 13 ship's captains clad in white uniforms to step ashore at Murray's Wharf at the foot of Wall Street as one woman threw flowers at him. He, quote, "read his history in a nation's eyes," wrote one, and be sworn in on the balcony of Federal Hall at the corner of Wall and Broad. And it was through those streets, the streets of the first capital of the new republic, that there walked the three men, Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, who together were Publius, author of the 85 great essays urging ratification of the controversial new Constitution. My cat is really... What was that, the Federalist Papers? Is that what they're talking about? See, my American history knowledge it's in there, but it's really deep in there. I don't always pull out all the words right away. My dad is an American history, like a middle school history teacher. And so, yeah, growing up sometimes when parents just kind of have to filibuster, my dad would sometimes like start saying things that he used to teach students. Because there were 10 years where he was a stay-at-home dad for me and my brothers. So it was fun for him to like remember the lessons he used to do. Anyway, to many of the reformer aristocrats, the history of those streets was family history. The roles of Citizens United and City Club, and of groups such as the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, were filled with names like Morris and Bayard and De Peyster and Van Rensselaer and Jerry and Hamilton, which are supposedly familiar names for them. But as the age of skyscrapers had made land so valuable that history could no longer find a place on it, they had to watch as cobbled slips and lanes had been paved over with asphalt, and as row after row of beautiful, sober, red-faced federal residencies, of buildings that housed sailmaker shops and ships' chandleries. I don't know any of these words. Ships' chandleries behind Greek lintels, and steeply pitched dormers, redolent of the harbor's historic sailing age, had crumbled beneath the wrecker's iron balls. Before their eyes, the elegant townhouses that had stood on State Street in a neat, graceful row had been torn down one by one, even number 9, where Lafayette had lived, until only one remained. The delicate ironwork of its balconies and the slimness of its tall white columns, an ironic grace note in a cityscape without grace. By 1939, France's Tavern was the only structure left associated with the 100 moments of triumphs and glory Washington had played out in those streets. In an area dedicated to commerce, in which men spoke in what Henry James called the vocabulary of thrift, there was no interest in a more epic vocabulary. I don't know if this is what he's referring to, but when I was at the Tenement Museum, which I've mentioned I think 3 times on this stream, because it keeps being relevant, they talked about how in the East Village there were there were just so many immigrants that spoke different languages that you would see signs in Yiddish, but then people often would understand Italian as well because there was like a wave of Italian immigration that came after a bunch of the because first it was German Jews, then like Eastern Jews came later, and then there were a bunch of Italian. I don't know. Basically, the waves of immigration each affected like the pidgin language that the merchants would all speak. It was kind of amazing. Anyway, and they would show signs, and like there would be like weird mixes of languages. I find that stuff to be so interesting. Oh, that's just normal in Luxembourg. Yeah. Wait. Where do you live? I forgot. I feel like I should remember this. Not Luxembourg. I don't think. Once Lower Manhattan had been steeped in history. Now that sense of history was gone, vanished, crushed out of the streets as completely as the sense of the sea. But turn a corner and there was history and sunlight and sky and stretching before you, sea. For turn a corner, the corner at the bottom of Pearl or Front Street, for example, or the bend at the foot of Broadway, and there was Battery Park. Step into Battery Park and suddenly, remarkably suddenly, the city was all behind you. Walk down one of its winding paths, for its paths were winding then, until the leaves of the big old streets that lined them, for they were lined with big old trees then, and the clamor of the traffic-jammed streets of Lower Manhattan faded away so quickly that within 100 paces, only an occasional particularly strident car horn remained as a remainder of what you had just escaped. Oh, nice. The Netherlands. Wait, what city? I should know this. I think you said you're from Utrecht or something, but I can't remember. Sorry, I should remember this. I feel like the number of cities in the Netherlands with a decent sized population, like there really aren't that many to choose from. I guess I could just keep naming them and eventually I would get there. But if you're from a small town, then there's no way I'm going to know it. Okay, I don't know. I don't even know how you would say that. I'm not very good at like the throaty, like the Nijmegen. That's how I would imagine that you're supposed to say it. Nich. I'm bad at that sort of sound, and even like I'm not very good at saying Utrecht. Okay, but that's a decently sized. Okay, I should be aware of it. I also should work on my pronunciation of like that branch of Germanic languages, like German, Dutch, all the ones that are like throaty. The ones that my ancestry is like almost totally Dutch. I'm just not very good at like the languages that where you kind of sound like you're coughing. My ancestors, I'm saying ancestors, but it's like basically there were people in Friesland that like there was a wave of immigration apparently to Michigan, West Michigan in like the 1910s, and I just had like a few great grandparents that were part of it. And so my mom's totally Dutch and my dad's let me think. My dad's half Dutch, so I'm 3/4 Dutch. And the rest is just like random European mutt. I think my dad's mom is a mix of a bunch of different things. My brother did one of those genetic tests. I didn't because I was like, "Oh, they're gonna have all my data," and I suppose they still have it anyway, but, I think my brother said that the other stuff was, like, random Swedish and Hungary. See, I don't know if this is interesting to anyone else, but it's fun for me to think about. But it's hard for me to even consider myself very Dutch because I just don't speak the language, I don't really know the culture, I'm so far removed from that generation. My grandparents can speak it, but they don't because they were born and raised in the States. And my mom doesn't really know it anymore. So, I don't know. Anyway, I'm just blabbing. Um, Sit down on one of the benches under the trees, and what you heard first was mostly quiet, as if your ears had become so attuned to the din you had left that for a minute or two they couldn't register more subtle sounds. But then you began to hear the sparrows and the orioles and the harsh, faraway scream of some seabird. You began to notice the flutter of a waxwing from tree to tree, the soft swoop of gulls across the high sky. If, sitting there, you looked back at the tall buildings behind you, you saw them through leaves, and they didn't look so tall. They seemed, in fact, rather far away. Only a few steps out of the sunless streets, you had found sunlight. Only a few steps out of their colorless walls, you had found green lawns. Only a few steps out of their tumult, you had found peace. And if you got up and walked a little deeper into the park, suddenly before you, there through the trees, was the heavy blue-green swell of the sea, and that rhythmic, restless sound, at once peaceful and intense, was the lapping of waves against the shore, and all at once, only steps from the dead gray walls of Lower Manhattan, you were standing at the edge of a broad and busy harbor. Crisscrossing the waves were stubby tugboats, freighters with derricks and masts, a tall forest on their decks, speedy motorboats skimming from crest to crest, gaily painted ferries, private steam yachts, white painted and glistening, giant gleaming ocean liners, so big that their sides were moving cliffs. Everywhere there were bright flags, the pennons and burgees of the yachts, the tricolor of the Normandie, and the Union Jack of the Queens, the colors of a dozen other foreign nations, and all fluttering against the blue of the sky. It was a panorama of vastness and beauty in the sun, of drama in storms, when the tossing whitecaps that stretched to the horizon, the howling of the wind that filled your ears, and the smash of the waves against the piers at your feet made you remember with a start that Manhattan was only an island, and that you were standing at its very tip. And at night, with the towering Statue of Liberty enlightening the world, floodlit from pedestal to torch, and the rows of lamps on the ferry boats gliding across the dark waters, the view from the Battery was, as one of the reformers put it, a thing of beauty never to be forgotten. Sunlight, serenity, a sense of the sea, and something more. For a walk into Battery Park at its Broadway entrance and staring at you at the end of a long, broad, grand allée was an odd-looking building. If you knew the history of New York City, you could read it in layers on that building. Architects remodeling it to make its appearance harmonize with its present purpose. For the last half century, it had been the city aquarium, had given it a 3-story high facade that made it look like a toy fort, with rounded turrets at each end, a cornice crenulated to resemble battlements and flags along the top, and a white stucco finish that, shining in the sun, would have made it a perfect target. In that gay facade, the massive bolt-studded and iron-reinforced doors, set in an immense stone portal 20 feet high, loomed with an inappropriate grimness. But if you knew the history of New York, you knew why those doors were there, and you knew that if you stripped that layer of stucco away from the lower story, you would find behind it huge, rugged walls of weather-beaten sandstone, walls 20 feet high and 8 feet thick, walls thick enough to withstand the bombardment of a fleet, walls through whose barred embrasures had glinted black 32-pounders, capable of sweeping the harbor from shore to shore. You knew that if the top 2 stories of that odd building were a fake fort, the bottom story behind the facade was a real fort, Fort Clinton, constructed during the War of 1812 to repel an expected British invasion. I don't think, did the War of 1812 make it to Manhattan? I don't think it did, but I don't really trust myself. I don't know nearly enough about the War of 1812. Yeah, the island makes it really interesting. I read somewhere too that because it was set up by a bunch of merchants, who like didn't really care about making it a home or a nice place to live. Like they set it up to have like these, so many streets all in grids because that was the easiest for trade. And yeah, it ended up and also the zoning was like really like there wasn't very much zoning. So basically, yeah, there were just like tons of really straight streets and everything was all mixed together, and like people say that's part of why it's so iconic, because other cities like Washington D.C., they have more windy streets and like it's interrupted by more parks and like broad, what's it called? Boulevards, which are apparently, even though in some ways they're nice to live, it's just not as dense. Fort Clinton, named after Erie Canal builder DeWitt. The fort, what? Okay. It's called Fort Clinton, so shouldn't it be named after someone named Clinton? Why is it named after someone named DeWitt? I don't know. The fort that in 1939 stood in Battery Park under a coat of white stucco and 2 stories of fish tanks had never fired a shot in anger. The expected British invasion never came, probably, historians believe, because the British were deterred by the presence of Fort Clinton and its sister fort on Governor's Island, Castle William. And no enemy fleet was ever again to threaten New York. The only ships ever sunk by its 28 32-pounders were hulks sunk for target practice. But the broad circle, a full 200 feet in diameter, of its massive walls was an evocation in weathered red sandstone of the nearly 2 centuries when men ran for forts at the news of Indians or the French. Walk down beside it, stand beside one of its embrasures, and see where its cannon bore. Then look out across the harbor and see, across a mile of water, the massive hulk, unstuccoed, grim, cannon still mounted, so that through its embrasures the sun still glinted off black metal, of its sister fort, and you were back in another more heroic age. Walk down beside it, and that city behind you, that city without history, had a history again. And in that building, there was the history of still another era to read. For behind that stucco facade was also a domed roof that, built in 1824, transformed Fort Clinton, its guns still in place, into Castle Clinton, or Castle Garden, circular auditorium and theater. If Fort Clinton was heroism, Castle Garden was the glory heroism earned. It was at Castle Garden on August 16, 1824, that, in the words of one historian, it was proved that republics are not always ungrateful. For it was at Castle Garden on that date that Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, who, as a rich young nobleman, had defied his king and fought for America, returned at 67 years old and penniless. Many of the spectators doubtless had okay, this is a quote. His name is DeWitt Clinton. Thanks so much for filling me in. I think today, I don't know why this is happening, but I feel like my brain is just operating a little bit less well. Like I'm coming across a lot of words that are like old war terms, and I'm just unable to sound them out, which should be like a first grade skill, but I'm trying my darndest out here. No, I did have coffee, so I don't know what my problem is. Okay, quote, many of the spectators doubtless had in mind a gallant, boyish figure in the buff and blue of the American Revolution with powdered hair tied in a queue, quote, one historian wrote. What they saw was an old civilian in a short-haired brown wig. But when the old civilian stepped onto the Castle Garden landing stage after a trip up the harbor on which his ship was escorted by a huge flotilla to begin a visit on which he was to receive from the government and citizens of the US gifts of bonds and of land worth almost $500,000, wow, the castle's cannon roared out 100 times. When the old man walked slowly into Battery Park, quote, to the incessant huzzas of the multitude that packed the waterfront, unquote, he walked between the weeping ranks of the Lafayette Guards. When he rode up Broadway, men and women on rooftops threw flowers in his path. A month later, a tall spar was raised in the center of the fort. A vast awning of sailcloth was spread across its entire ceiling. Quote, the white banner of France was entwined with the stars and stripes. Trophies of arms glittered from the walls. And when Lafayette appeared at the ball, quote, the gay sets dissolved, unquote. And the dancers formed a long lane, and as the old man walked along it, he saw that each man and woman was wearing a medallion bearing his likeness, and the woman's entwined with roses. The incessant huzzas is like kind of a tongue twister if you say it enough. And it was at Castle Clinton that 10 years later, the handful of Lafayette Guards still alive drew up in a hollow square, in the center of which was a riderless black horse, spurred boots, reversed, slung across its empty saddle to hear the funeral oration for their dead hero. Lafayette was, this is my last paragraph, I think. Lafayette was only one of 100 heroes for whom the old fort and Battery Park were the setting for the spectacles, honoring them in triumph or in death. Troops were drawn up in the park by the thousands to greet Dewey after he defeated the Spaniards at Manila. The Astrakhan busbies of cavalry hussars shook in the sea breeze. Sorry if I said all of those things wrong. Pershing, after he defeated the Germans in France, and TR, I'm assuming that's Teddy Roosevelt, after he returned from safari, conspicuous among the regiments out in full dress to greet the ex-president, were a handful of men in khakis and campaign hats, the Rough Riders. Wow. See, I don't know enough about Pershing, but I just remember he is the namesake of a street in Chicago where I would frequently ride the bus. And it would be like, Pershing, stop. I'm assuming that's the same guy. Most of New York's great triumphal processions began there. It was at the Battery that Wiley Post came ashore, and Admiral Byrd and Gertrude E. Darrell. Do you know Gertrude E. Darrell? I'm looking her up. I don't know who that is. Gertrude. Oh, it's an American swimmer. That's very cool. She lived from 1905 to she lived from 1905 to 2003, and she was the first woman to swim the English Channel. They call her the Queen of Waves. Okay, that's cool. I probably should have known who she was. I'm gonna and Amelia Earhart and Cost and Ballant, and of course Lindbergh, slim, bare-headed Lindbergh, to be greeted by Grover Whalen and to ride in an open car between mounted policemen, the short, glorious mile up a Broadway whose canyons were swirling with confetti. The fort's cannon boomed at solemn 1-minute intervals as the body of young Captain James Lawrence, who had earned immortality by crying, "Don't give up the ship," as he lay dying on the deck of the Chesapeake, was carried ashore, and as Washington's riderless horse and Hamilton's and those of a score of other heroes of the Revolution were let out from its Broadway. Broadway. In New York, in which the old was ruthlessly demolished to make way for the new, the fort was pricelessly rich in ghosts of the city's great past. Okay, I'm gonna call it there. Oh, the person that tries all the sandwiches. Yeah, wait, is that I think it's a newsletter that they do that, right? I think that's the sandwich person. I've seen mention of this on Twitter, and I remember looking at it a while ago, but I can't remember all the details. One thing about the list of sandwiches, okay, I thought it was interesting, and then I thought for 1 second about, oh, what if I tried to eat sandwiches from the list of sandwiches? But then I remembered that I'm a vegetarian, so it doesn't really work. it wouldn't really. Okay. I'm sure I will be able to find it if I Google enough. Okay. Goodbye.